Hi everybody, my name's Kieran Lawrence. I'm a PhD student at Durham University. I'd just like to start by saying thank you to the Society for asking me along to give a talk. It's a real privilege. I'm going to be giving a talk today on some work I've been doing as part of my PhD. It's a study that me and my collaborators have actually just had published in the journey Global Change Biology. So I'm very excited to share it with you all. So what this study is an assessment of the timing of passerine migration and how that's changed over the last 50 to 60 years, particularly with a focus from the African non-breeding grounds, kind of trying to get away from the European perspective we typically have on ornithology. So I'd just like to start by defining this word phenology. It's a word I'm going to try and use not very much at all because I try to stay away from scientific terminology where possible, but I might slip into it, so I'm sorry if I do. So phenology essentially is the timing of biological events and how the timing in comparison to other biological events, and also the timing in comparison to the same events but in different years. So this could include things such as bud burst out in trees, or egg laying in birds, or egg hatch out in caterpillars, or of course the timing of bird migration. So we know that these events are very heavily selected upon. The timing of these events have been shaped by millions of years of evolution, and that's so that they're timed well in relation to other events. So for example, if we take the food web of a blue tit and the oak processionary moth caterpillar and the oak tree, we know that blue tits have a very specific range of laying dates that mean that when their chicks hatch out later down the line, they're hatching out at a time when there's kind of the peak abundance of oak processionary moth caterpillars. So there's the peak abundance of food to feed all of these chicks so that they have the highest survival rate. Now we know that a lot of these events are timed with things like the length of days or with temperatures. So typically as we get out of winter, and into spring, days are getting longer and temperatures are rising. And this allows organisms to judge when they should start getting on with things. Now what we also know is that temperatures have changed quite drastically over the past 50 years. We've seen great warming of the entire globe really, but particularly in these temperate latitudes that we're in Europe and North America and Asia. And what this means is we've seen the advancement of the phenology, the timing of lots of biological events, and this includes things such as the leaf out of trees and the hatching, therefore, of these caterpillars in order to these caterpillars are emerging in order to eat the very fresh young oak leaves that don't have yet many toxins in them and things like that. So they're hatching out at a very specific time. And because the tree is leafing out in relation to increased temperatures earlier in the spring each year, it means that these caterpillars are also doing the same. Unfortunately, what we know is that birds haven't quite been able to advance their laying date, their breeding, as much as these events. And what we therefore see is something we term phenological mismatch. And this is, although you can see here by this blue curve that the laying date has advanced in relation to this earlier year, and therefore the hatch out date shown by this red line also has advanced. The green line showing that the peak abundance of caterpillars has advanced far greater, and indicated by this arrow, which is represents the same amount of time in each plot. As therefore the timing when there's the most requirement for food from these chicks no longer falls in line with the peak abundance of caterpillars. And what that means is there's likely to be reduced survival of chicks, and therefore we might see reductions in the populations of such species. Now this impacts all species, or is likely to do so at least. We know it happens in blue tits and grey tits, but there's a group of species that this may have particular particularly negative connotations for. Take, for example, this windchat, a long-distance migrant that is breeding in Europe and across much of the Palearctic region. And then in autumn, it will make a migration to sub-Saharan Africa. And then again, spend the winter there, and in spring, early spring, make a migration back to Europe in order to breed. Now, while species such as the blue tit and grey tit are constantly present in their breeding areas, they're able to judge kind of when spring is starting to occur. Long distance migrants such as this windchat haven't got that. It's not quite as easy as that for them. They're having to judge when spring might be starting on their breeding grounds, sometimes from an entirely different hemisphere. And as a result of that, we've seen that long distance migrants are more phenologically mismatched than resident counterparts, and this might play a role in the trends we've seen in long distance migrant populations, and that is that these species are declining again more rapidly than either their resident or even their short distance migratory counterparts. Now, even those short distance migratory counterparts, by having non-breeding ranges that are closer to their breeding range, that might allow them even just slightly more opportunity to anticipate the breeding conditions and give them a better chance to time that breeding period. What we have seen though is that long distance migrants have actually advanced their migration dates, and that means that they're arriving on the breeding grounds earlier each year, as you can see highlighted by these black lines and black dots and solid black lines there, sorry. And by arriving back on the breeding grounds earlier, they're enabling themselves to start kind of the entire breeding period earlier, lay earlier, and have chicks hatch out earlier, hopefully more in line with the phenology of the ecosystems in which they're breeding. But we know that it's not enough to be able to keep up with the advancements of the trees and the food supply, and they're still suffering from this mismatch. Unfortunately, all of the data that we have about this more or less comes from Europe and North America, obviously where the vast majority of the naturalists are, where we're able to collect such data, where there's such funding for such work to go on. And this means that we know relatively little about places such as Asia. We know relatively little about the timing of breeding and the mismatch conditions there. But also, even within the flyways in which Europe and North America are positioned, we don't really know what's going on in these species' non-breeding areas. So this pied flycatcher that breeds across much of Europe goes to winter in sub-Saharan Africa, but we know relatively little about the timing of migrations from those areas. And realistically, our predictions of how species might adapt to continued climate change, we know now that by the end of the century there's going to be at least another degree of warming, which to us might not sound like a lot, but to these species it will drastically change the timing of their breeding. The ability of these species to be able to adapt to those further changes is dependent on the mechanisms by which they're using to arrive on the breeding grounds earlier. So are they migrating faster, or are they departing from their non-breeding areas earlier each year? And also we need to know what is enabling these species to be able to make those judgments. So obviously they can't directly tell what is going on in Europe or North America. So what cues are they using to be able to time their breeding? And is there anything that's likely to limit them being able to advance this more quickly? So generally, what were our research questions? So we wanted to see whether changes in the timing of arrival at the breeding grounds are mirrored by those in departure from the non-breeding grounds, or whether this phenomenon is likely due to an increase in migration speed. We wanted to see whether species are spending longer on the breeding grounds as a result of longer growing seasons. As I mentioned, we know relatively little about what is going on in the non-breeding grounds, but even more so, we kind of don't really know what's going on in in our autumns towards the end of the breeding season. We don't know whether the advancements in arrival date are also matched by advancements in departure from Europe and North America, or whether species are able to linger in our on our shores for a greater amount of time, purely because we're having warmer autumns, which mean a longer growing season, more food availability, and the potential to have extra broods of chicks. And finally, like I briefly mentioned, we wanted to see what the drivers of some of these departure decisions are, what is causing species to decide this is the right time to set off on both my spring and autumn migrations. So to kind of analyse all of this, we obviously had to have some data, and we were lucky enough to work with a team that were based either in the Gambia and also in Gibraltar. So from the Gambia, we had citizen science observations of 20 species of bird that breed in Europe and spend their wintering period in sub-Saharan Africa, and that went all the way back to kind of the mid-60s. And then we also had from Gibraltar on the southern tip of Spain, we had daily ringing data that stretched back to 1991, and that was for 14 of the species that we considered from the Gambia. And hopefully by taking those two sites together, we should be able to build up a picture of the timing of migration for species that migrate along the East Atlantic flyway that you can see highlighted in yellow here. So species breeding all across kind of the Western Palearctic and migrating down the western side of Africa to their non-breeding grounds for the winter. So we wanted to look at trends in migration date, both pre-breeding migration, migration after breeding, and also then we could take those and mash them together to look at how long a species had stayed both in the breeding grounds and in the non-breeding grounds. And to do this, we used first and last dates from both the Gambia and Gibraltar, and we also considered median dates for Gibraltar, and that was to give us a bit more of a rounded view on the entire population. If we just consider first and last dates, it gives us an idea of what's going on, but those might just be very extreme individuals, and therefore to give us a more sound view of the entire population, we used median dates at Gibraltar. Unfortunately, those weren't available in the Gambia, so we just hoped that we assessed whether the trends were similar in each area to give us an idea of whether we could extrapolate the results from the Gambia to Gibraltar. So what we started off doing was to assess the trends in each species individually, as you can see plotted out here, with looking at how the day of migration, of pre-breeding migration, changed over year. But what you can see is that we only actually have one data point per year for each of these species, and that doesn't really give us much of an ability to conduct any rigorous analyses. So what we did was we grouped all of the data for these species together to give kind of a broad picture on what is happening across all of these kind of passerine migratory birds. And what we found was that between kind of the late 60s and the present day, pre-breeding migration had advanced significantly year on year. You can see the data in yellow here represents the Gambia, and the other two represent Gibraltar, just with first and last dates. And we see that in the Gambia, pre-breeding migration was advancing by almost half a day a year, and by about a third of a day a year in Gibraltar. And conversely, looking at post-breeding migration, so migration in the autumn, we see that it's actually getting later and later each year as we considered it might do. So yeah, and these trends were again similar between the Gambia and Gibraltar. And if we take those together, perhaps the most surprising result that we see is obviously if species are arriving in Europe earlier and they're departing later, we see that they're actually spending a lot more time in Europe now than they did at the start of the 90s. And also in Gambia, they're spending a lot more time in kind of the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa now than they did at the start of the 60s. So, and we're not talking about kind of small little changes here. the time that these species are spending in sub-Saharan Africa is 2 months less now than it was kind of 60 years ago, and even over a much shorter time scale, almost 2 weeks more in Europe now than they were around 30 years ago. So not menial changes by any stretch of the imagination. They're really changing the kind of the landscape of species in those respective areas in the periods where either they are no longer there or are there for even longer each year. So to go one step further, we wanted to see maybe what was driving some of these trends, what is causing species to migrate earlier in the spring and later in the autumn. And we considered variables such as temperature, where the species were using the ambient temperature to judge when to leave, or the normalized difference vegetation index, which is essentially just a measure of how much greenery is in the area, and this might be able to tell us something about how much food in the form of berries and fruits or insects there are. And also the North Atlantic Oscillation Index, and what that is essentially just the pressure difference over the sea from the Azores over here and Iceland. And that doesn't really mean very much to me, or it might not mean much to you, but in years where we see a very strong index, that typically correlates with very wet and warm springs in Europe, and previous studies have found that in those years birds are arriving earlier back in Europe to take advantage of those conditions. So what we found was that in pre-breeding migration, we found that, as you might predict, when the Sahel, which is a region just to the south of the Sahara Desert, when that region is particularly green, when there's a particular abundance of food, we find that species are able to depart from sub-Saharan Africa earlier. So this is likely because there's a big glut of food around, and they're able to feed up quite quickly and build up the huge fat reserves that these species need to be able to complete these very long distance migrations. And perhaps surprisingly, we found that this is going back to that index that we talked about. So when there is a very strong index, and we see that we have these storms coming across the Atlantic, and Europe is very warm and wet in early spring, and we'd predict that species maybe should be departing earlier in these years. What we actually found was that species were arriving later back in southern Europe, so at Gibraltar down here. But what you might also be able to pick up from this figure is that we have, during these times, we have stronger trade winds, and also the kind of North Africa and southern Europe are particularly dry. And what that might mean is that the winds hold up birds trying to fly north, and also then when they arrive in North Africa and need to refuel after crossing the Sahara Desert, undertaking quite a mammoth journey and needing to refuel, because it's so dry, there's not very many resources around, and the food supply might not be quite as large, and that could mean that it takes them quite a bit longer to be able to build up those reserves again and continue into southern Europe and eventually get to their breeding grounds. And finally, one thing that we found was that these, while we could explain some of the trends through those two variables I've talked about, there was also still just this trend where essentially those two variables couldn't explain all of the variation. And what we interpret that as is a form of natural selection going on here. So many people might have heard of natural selection occurring in Darwin's finches, as we see here, where we have one ancestral state, so one species very, very long time ago, and they were dispersed onto different islands that had different niches to be able to explore, and they required different adaptations to be able to feed on different food sources. So what we consider is not a morphological selection as is being displayed here, but actually a behavioural selection. And what we hypothesize is that because springs are occurring earlier each year, those species that are arriving earlier each year in Europe, are timing their breeding better, and are therefore being able to raise more chicks, which fledge more successfully. And those chicks will carry the genes of those adult birds, and are therefore also likely to migrate inherently early. And we get that snowballing effect where over years we find that those species that migrate earliest are the ones that do the best, and therefore those are the birds that we see surviving in the population. So post-breeding migration was slightly, the kind of drivers of this was slightly less obvious, and we couldn't really tease out very much interesting information. But one thing that definitely was interesting was we found that in years which the dry season in the Sahel, that area to the south of the Sahara Desert that I talked about, in years in which the dry season occurs later there, we find that species are departing from Europe later. Now we don't know the mechanisms by which species might be able to detect that this is happening, but what appears to be causing this is that typically there's a wet season in the Sahel, kind of through our summer, so kind of from April onwards, and this dies out in around September. So in around September and October, the vegetation is starting to brown quite a lot. It's not quite as productive, and therefore the food source is drastically dropping off. And in years in which that is occurring earlier, species might have to leave Europe earlier because they're crossing the Sahara Desert and arriving in this area, and then discovering that there's really no food around after making this mammoth crossing and having to refuel. However, in years in which that dry season occurs later, species might be able to linger longer within Europe because there's not quite such a pressure for them to cross the Sahara before all of these resources dry up. So what does all of this mean? I've kind of given you all of these results, but what does that mean for long distance migrants going forward? How might this have an impact on their populations, or how might they be able to adapt to further warming of the globe? So what we saw was that long distance migrants are actually able to advance their pre-breeding departure from sub-Saharan Africa. And what that might do is render species more resistant to kind of phenological advances of their breeding habitats. So while those breeding habitats continue to advance the timing of kind of the peak food source, we kind of considered that species long distance migrants weren't able to keep up with this. However, if they're able to advance from the non-breeding areas earlier each year, we might eventually get to a stage where they are actually keeping up with those advances in their kind of breeding ecosystems. However, one thing to consider, or a couple of things to consider, is that the timing of the migration appears to be dependent heavily on food availability. So we saw that in years in which kind of the Sahel was more green and more rich and more food around, species were able to migrate earlier from the Gambia. But one thing we do know, or predictions that we've made in relation to climate change, is that the warmer the globe gets, the more likely that Sahelian region is to suffer from more regular droughts, and the availability of food might drop off, and that might restrict the ability of these species to fatten up for these migrations. They might have to linger for a longer period to feed up, and therefore limit the ability to advance earlier each year. And also we saw that these species are affected by the conditions en route, and we're not really sure yet how climate change might affect these kind of circulation patterns and what impact it might have on that, the index, the North Atlantic Oscillation Index, and whether that might play a role in the strengths of the trade winds and things like that. What we also saw was that post-breeding migration was maybe less strict. It's maybe possibility for species to linger in Europe longer. It's not quite as strong of a selection pressure. what we found was that the Sahelian dry season is occurring later each year, and that's a pattern that's kind of stretched back to the middle of the last century, and that appears to have allowed species to linger within their breeding areas for longer each year. And also with European autumns being warmer and potentially more productive, that might enable again species to take advantage of a richer glut of resources, more so than there were in kind of the early 90s. And this has led to later departure year on year. And if we take later departure and earlier arrival together, we saw that there was an overall decrease in the amount of time that these species were spending in Africa. And if that trend was to occur, was to continue occurring year on year, we know that springs are going to get earlier, and like I said, that autumn's likely to get later. We could eventually reach a point where species are spending all of their time in Europe. This is something we've already seen, obviously, with species such as the blackcap and the chiffchaff displayed here. Many people listening to this might have a blackcap or a chiffchaff that spends the entire winter in their garden feeding on berries and any insects that are able to survive, because our winters are becoming more and more mild each year. So yeah, we might see that species no longer need to migrate all the way to sub-Saharan Africa. They typically would do this in order to escape our cold and harsh winters. But if we're getting more mild and less harsh winters year on year, that might reduce the need for species to do so. So that could have benefits for these migratory populations. We know that the biggest mortality for migratory species occurs when they're on migration and they don't really know the distribution of resources, or there might be new predators in certain areas that they don't come across when they're either on the breeding or non-breeding grounds. So if species were to stop in kind of southern France or Spain or Italy and not have to migrate all the way to sub-Saharan Africa, we might actually see that this has positive connotations for their population trends. And also, if these species were therefore wintering closer to their breeding grounds, they effectively become short distance migrants. And we already know that short distance migrants are less phenologically mismatched, like I said, presumably because they're closer to the breeding grounds and they're more able to judge the conditions on the breeding grounds for kind of timing the start of spring and the start of the breeding period. So that might allow these long distance migrants to time their breeding better. This would, however, potentially have knock-on effects on their new non-breeding grounds, as well as those that they used to use. So within Europe, if these species were to spend the entire year, that might have we already know that the species resident in this area, in these areas, so there will be increased competition throughout the winter for food resources, and food resources that are already really quite limited within those periods. So there will be increased competition, and that could have knock-on effects on resident and short-distance migratory populations. And conversely, in kind of sub-Saharan Africa, there might be the opposite effect, where we see that there's less competition for the resident species, but it also might have negative impacts on things like seed dispersal and insect control. We know that species that migrate from Europe down to sub-Saharan Africa play quite a large role in dispersing the seeds of plants around, and they're obviously feeding on insects all of the time, and therefore controlling their populations. So we're not really yet sure what knock-on effects that they could have in both of these areas. So on that note, I'd just like to say thanks a lot for listening, and again to the Society for inviting me along to give this talk. I hope it's been informative and interesting, and anyone who would like to know any more is very free to contact me either through Twitter or through my university's website at the bottom there. So I'd just like to say thank you again for listening.